The attack came in the darkness before sunrise, when the hunters were gone. Samuel Granger dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the small hut where he heard children breathing in sleep. He was a tall man, with a grey beard that reached his chest, wearing a long coat darkened by swamp water. His boots made no sound on the wet ground. Behind him, 6 men spread through the settlement like shadows, each one moving toward a different home. Granger had watched this place for 2 weeks. He knew the pattern. Every few days, the adults left before dawn to hunt deer in the deeper swamps or gather medicinal herbs along the riverbanks. They would be gone until afternoon. Only the children remained behind, watched by 3 elderly women and 1 old man too weak to walk far. This morning the settlement was defenseless. Granger pushed open the wooden door of the first hut. Inside, 3 girls slept on woven mats near a dying fire. The oldest was maybe 12. She wore a short tunic made of cotton and decorated with small glass beads, the kind traded by Choctaw families who still remembered their old ways. When Granger stepped inside, she woke and screamed. He bent down and grabbed her by the arm. She fought, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. He dragged her outside into the fog. An elderly woman ran from another hut, shouting and reaching for the girl, but one of Granger's men shoved her to the ground. She fell hard and didn't get up. All around the settlement, the same scene repeated. Men kicked open doors. Girls were pulled from their beds, their tunics torn, their beaded necklaces breaking and scattering into the dirt. They cried for their mothers and fathers who weren't there. They screamed in Choctaw and English and the mixed language their community had created. 2 of Granger's men pushed a pair of young sisters toward a wooden wagon waiting at the edge of the clearing. The girls stumbled forward, their bare feet slipping in the mud. 1 man shoved them hard when they tried to stop. Another threw a 3rd girl into the wagon bed, where she landed hard and curled into a ball, sobbing. The old man tried to stand in front of the wagon. He raised a walking stick and shouted at the men to stop. One of Granger's riders knocked him aside with his horse. The old man collapsed into the dirt, gasping for air. The fog hung thick in the air. Smoke rose from cooking fires that still smoldered. Tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Within 20 minutes, 10 girls were bound and loaded into 2 wagons. Granger climbed onto the driver's seat, looked back at the crying children, and snapped the reins. The wagons rolled south through the swamp, leaving deep tracks in the mud. Behind them, the 3 elderly women knelt in the clearing, holding each other and weeping. The old man lay on the ground, breathing hard, staring at the place where the wagons had disappeared. When the parents returned that afternoon, they would find their daughters gone. And they would become something more dangerous than hunters. They would become avengers. Before we continue with this shocking story of revenge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you, and let's continue. The settlement had no name on any map. It existed in the space between what white men claimed and what the swamp would allow them to control. 23 families lived there. Some were Choctaw people who had hidden when the government forced their nation westward in 1831. Others were escaped slaves who had found freedom in the maze of waterways that fed into the Yazoo River. Over time, these 2 groups had become one people, speaking a mix of Choctaw, English, and the African languages some of the elders still remembered. The settlement sat on a ridge of high ground, surrounded by cypress swamp. The homes were simple, walls made of mud and woven cane, roofs thatched with palmetto leaves. Smoke rose from cooking fires every morning. Children played near the water, catching crawfish and small fish. Women wove baskets and sewed clothing decorated with glass beads traded from freed blacks in Yazoo City. Men hunted deer, trapped muskrat and beaver, and brought back wild turkey and duck. They survived by staying invisible. But invisibility only works if no one is looking. Samuel Granger had been looking for 3 weeks. He owned Black River Plantation in Holmes County, 40 miles south of the settlement. His land produced cotton, timber, and profit. He owned 43 slaves, at least that's what his record said. In truth, fewer than 20 of those people had legal bills of sale. The others had been acquired the way Granger acquired most things, through violence, deception, and the knowledge that in Mississippi, a white man's word was law. Granger had learned about the settlement from a trader named Lucas Prine, a man who moved through the Delta buying furs and selling ammunition. Prine had visited the hidden community twice, trading flour and salt for beaver pelts. He told Granger about the children. "Plenty of young ones," Prine had said, sitting in Granger's parlor and drinking whiskey. "Girls mostly, 7, 8, 10 years old, healthy, strong. Nobody in Natchez would ask questions if you brought them in with the right papers." Granger understood what Prine was suggesting. In the Natchez slave market, children were valuable. A girl between 8 and 12 could be sold for $200 to $300, depending on her health and appearance. Boys were worth less unless they were old enough to work in the fields. But girls could be sold as house servants, and buyers paid more for house servants. 10 girls would bring $3,000, maybe more. Granger spent 2 weeks watching the settlement. He camped a mile away, hidden in thick brush, and observed the daily routines. He saw that the adults left before dawn every few days to hunt in the deeper parts of the swamp or to gather plants along the riverbanks. The women collected roots, bark, and leaves used for medicine and cooking. The men tracked deer and set traps for small game. These trips lasted most of the day. When the adults were gone, only the children remained, watched by a few elderly people too old to walk long distances. Granger saw his opportunity. On the night of October 14, 1854, he gathered 6 men, overseers and slave catchers he had used before. He told them the plan. "We go in before dawn," he said. "The adults will be gone. We take the girls, load them in the wagons, and we're back at Black River by afternoon, fast and clean, no bodies, no mess." One of the men, a lean Kentuckian named Howell, asked, "What about the old folks?" "They won't fight," Granger said, "and if they do, we handle it." The men nodded. They had done this kind of work before. They rode out at 3 in the morning, moving quietly through the swamp. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to see the trail. Granger led the way. He knew the route. He had memorized every turn, every crossing, every stretch of solid ground. By 4 o'clock they reached the edge of the settlement. The homes were dark. Cooking fires had burned down to glowing coals. A few dogs stirred but didn't bark. Granger's men had brought strips of salted pork and tossed them to the animals as they approached. Granger signaled his men to spread out. Each man knew which hut to enter. They moved like shadows through the fog. Granger approached the largest hut, where he had seen 3 girls sleeping during his earlier observations. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and cornbread. 3 girls lay on woven mats near the fire. The oldest looked about 12. She wore a simple tunic made of cotton cloth, decorated with small blue and white beads sewn along the neckline. Her hair was braided and tied with a strip of red fabric. Granger stepped inside. His boots scraped against the dirt floor. The girl's eyes opened. For a moment, she stared at him, confused. Then she understood. She screamed. Granger lunged forward and grabbed her by the arm. She kicked at him, her small fists pounding against his chest. He dragged her toward the door. The 2 younger girls woke and began crying, scrambling backward against the wall. Outside, the settlement erupted in chaos. An elderly woman ran from a nearby hut, shouting in Choctaw. She reached for the girl Granger was dragging, trying to pull her away. One of Granger's men, a thick-shouldered overseer named Cobb, shoved the woman hard. She fell backward into the dirt and lay still, stunned. All around the clearing, men were pulling girls from their homes. A pair of sisters, both wearing short tunics decorated with shell beads, were pushed toward the wooden wagon waiting at the edge of the settlement. They stumbled forward, barefoot, their feet slipping in the mud. One of the men shoved the older sister when she tried to stop. She fell to her knees, and he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her the rest of the way. Another girl, no more than 8 years old, was thrown into the back of the wagon. She landed hard on the wooden boards and curled into a ball, sobbing. An old man appeared from one of the huts. He was thin and bent, his hair white, his face deeply lined. He carried a wooden walking stick. He stepped in front of the wagon and raised the stick, shouting at the men to stop. Howell rode his horse forward and knocked the old man aside with the animal's shoulder. The man collapsed into the dirt, gasping, clutching his ribs. One of the elderly women ran to him, kneeling beside him and crying. Granger dragged the girl he had captured to the wagon and lifted her inside. She fought every step, scratching at his hands, biting at his fingers. He slapped her hard across the face and she went silent, stunned. "Tie them," Granger ordered. His men used rough hemp rope to bind the girl's wrists. Some of the children were too shocked to resist. Others screamed and kicked until they were hit or threatened. Within 20 minutes, 10 girls sat in the 2 wagons, their hands bound, their faces streaked with tears. The youngest was 7, the oldest was 13. Granger climbed onto the driver's seat of the first wagon. He looked back at the settlement. The elderly women stood in the clearing, holding each other, weeping. The old man still lay on the ground, breathing in short, painful gasps. A few younger children, too young to be worth taking, stood in the doorways of the huts, staring in silence. Granger snapped the reins. The horses started forward, pulling the wagons south through the swamp. Behind them, the fog swallowed the settlement. The journey to Black River Plantation took 6 hours. The wagons followed old logging roads and hunting trails, moving slowly through thick forest and across shallow streams. The girls sat in silence for the first hour, too shocked and terrified to speak. Then the youngest began to cry again, and soon others joined her. Granger didn't stop. He didn't look back. By mid-morning, the swamp gave way to cleared land. Fields of cotton stretched in every direction, the white bolls ready for harvest. In the distance, the main house of Black River Plantation rose above the fields, a 2-story structure made of whitewashed wood, with a wide porch and tall windows. But the wagons didn't go to the main house. They turned onto a narrow road that led to the slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins near the edge of the property. Beyond the cabins stood a larger building, a storage barn used for tools and equipment. Next to the barn was a smaller structure with no windows, just a heavy wooden door with an iron lock. This was the quarantine shed. Granger used this building to hold newly captured or purchased slaves before integrating them into the plantation workforce. It was a place where people could be kept isolated, controlled, and broken of any resistance. The wagons stopped in front of the shed. Granger climbed down and unlocked the door. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of old wood and sweat. There were no beds, just a dirt floor covered with straw. A single bucket sat in the corner. "Get them inside," Granger said. His men untied the girls from the wagons and pushed them toward the shed. Some of the girls tried to run, but the men were faster. They grabbed the children and shoved them through the door. One girl fell and scraped her knee on the threshold. She cried out, but no one helped her up. When all 10 girls were inside, Granger closed the door and locked it. "They stay here until tomorrow," he said. "I'll ride to Natchez in the morning and find a buyer. Should have them sold by the end of the week." One of his men, Cobb, asked, "What if someone comes looking for them?" Granger smiled, his gray beard splitting to show yellowed teeth. "No one's coming. Those people in the swamp don't have papers, don't have rights, don't have anything. They can't go to the law, they can't do anything." The men laughed. Inside the shed, the girls huddled together in the darkness. The oldest girl, the one Granger had taken first, wrapped her arms around the younger ones. She whispered to them in Choctaw, trying to calm them. but she couldn't stop shaking. The hunters returned to the settlement just after noon. There were 12 of them, 8 men and 4 women. They had left before dawn to check trap lines along the river and to hunt deer in the deeper swamps. It had been a good morning. They carried 2 deer, a dozen muskrats, and several pounds of wild greens and medicinal roots. They walked into the clearing, laughing and talking, expecting to see children running to greet them. Instead, they found silence. The elderly women sat on the ground near the central fire pit, holding each other and rocking back and forth. The old man lay on a mat inside one of the huts, his breathing shallow, his face twisted in pain. A few young children, too small to have been taken, stood nearby, their eyes wide and empty. One of the hunters, a man named Gideon Redpath, dropped the deer he was carrying and ran forward. "What happened?" he shouted. One of the elderly women looked up. Her face was streaked with tears. "White men," she said in Choctaw. "They came before sunrise. They took the girls." Gideon felt the ground drop away beneath him. "How many?" 10. His daughter was one of them. She was 11 years old. Her name was Mary. Another hunter, a woman named Naomi, fell to her knees. "Where did they go?" The old man spoke from inside the hut, his voice weak. "South. They had wagons, 2 wagons. They went south." Gideon turned and looked at the others. Their faces showed the same thing he felt, grief, rage, and something deeper, a kind of violence that had been held back for too long. "We go after them," Gideon said. No one disagreed. They moved quickly. The women gathered food, dried fish, cornmeal, strips of smoked venison. The men collected weapons, knives, hatchets, a few old rifles that had been hidden in the swamp for years. One man had a pistol he had taken from a slave catcher 5 years earlier. Gideon knelt beside the wagon tracks left in the mud at the edge of the settlement. He studied them carefully. 2 wagons, both heavily loaded. The tracks were deep and clear. "They have maybe 6 hours on us," Gideon said. "But wagons are slow. We can catch them." Another man, a Choctaw hunter named Thomas Crow, pointed to markings on a nearby tree, fresh cuts made with a hatchet. "They're marking the trail. They've done this before." Gideon nodded. "Then we follow the marks." By early afternoon, the group of 12 hunters set out. They moved fast, following the wagon tracks south through the swamp. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The trail led through Atala County, a region of thick pine forests and red clay hills. The hunters moved without stopping, following the wagon tracks and the hatchet marks on the trees. They crossed shallow creeks, climbed ridges, and pushed through thorny underbrush that tore at their clothes and skin. By nightfall, they had covered 20 miles. They didn't make camp. They kept walking, using the moon for light. Gideon led the way, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. Behind him, the others moved in silence, their faces hard and grim. Around midnight, they reached a small settlement of freed blacks near the town of Kosciuszko. The people there knew Gideon. He had traded with them before, selling furs and buying salt and flour. An old woman named Esther came out of her cabin when she heard them approaching. She took one look at their faces and understood. "What do you need?" she asked. "Water," Gideon said, "and information. 2 wagons came through here, white men. They had children." Esther nodded. "I saw them. This morning just after dawn. They stopped at the creek to water their horses. I didn't see the children, but I heard crying from the wagons." "Where were they going?" "South, toward Holmes County. There's a plantation down there near the Big Black River. Black River Plantation. The man who owns it is named Granger. He's known for buying people without papers." Gideon felt his jaw tighten. "How far?" "Another 15 miles, maybe less." Esther brought them water and cornbread. The hunters drank and ate quickly, then set out again. They reached the edge of Holmes County just before dawn. The land here was flatter, with wide cotton fields stretching between patches of forest. In the distance, they saw smoke rising from chimneys, the plantation houses of wealthy white men. Gideon stopped on a low hill and studied the land below. He could see a large plantation in the valley, a white house, several barns, and a row of slave cabins. Beyond the cabins, he saw a smaller building with a locked door. "That's it," Thomas Crow said quietly. "That's where they are." Gideon nodded. "We wait until dark. Then we move." The hunters found cover in a stand of oak trees on the hillside. From there they could watch the plantation without being seen. They saw slaves working in the fields, picking cotton under the eyes of armed overseers. They saw white men on horses riding between the rows of plants. They saw the locked shed near the slave quarters, and they saw Samuel Granger, the man with the grey beard, walking from the main house toward the shed. Gideon watched him unlock the door and step inside. A moment later, he heard children crying. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. "Tonight," he said. "We end this tonight." As the sun set, the plantation grew quiet. The field workers returned to their cabins, exhausted from a day of labor under the October heat. Overseers gathered near the main house, drinking and laughing. Granger sat on his porch, smoking a pipe and counting money. The hunters waited in the darkness. Around midnight, 2 men emerged from the slave quarters and moved quietly toward the trees where the hunters were hidden. They had been sent by the other enslaved workers, who had seen the strangers on the hillside and understood what they were. The 2 men were named Elias and Jonah. Elias was in his 40s, a tall man with scars on his back from years of whippings. Jonah was younger, maybe 30, with strong hands and sharp eyes. Both had been brought to Black River Plantation against their will. Both had thought about escape. Both had thought about revenge. Gideon met them at the edge of the trees. "You know why we're here," he said quietly. Elias nodded. "We saw the girls. They're in the shed. Granger plans to take them to Natchez tomorrow morning. He's already sent word to a buyer." "How many men does he have?" 6 overseers, plus Granger and his brother Edward. All of them have guns. Gideon considered this. "Can you get to the shed?" Jonah spoke for the first time. "We can. But if we do this, we're not just freeing your daughters, we're freeing everyone, all 43 of us, and we're not leaving anyone alive to come after us." Gideon looked at him. "You understand what that means?" "I understand," Jonah said. "We've been waiting for a reason to fight. You just gave us one." They spent the next hour planning. The enslaved workers would create a distraction near the main house, a fire in one of the barns. While the overseers rushed to put it out, the hunters would move to the shed and free the girls. Then together, they would take the weapons from the overseers and deal with Granger and his men. It was a plan built on desperation and rage, but it was the only plan they had. Elias and Jonah returned to the slave quarters. The hunters waited in the darkness, their weapons ready. At 2 in the morning, flames rose from the hay barn near the main house. The overseers shouted and ran toward the fire, carrying buckets of water. Granger and his brother came out of the house, yelling orders. In the chaos, no one noticed the shadows moving toward the locked shed. Gideon reached the shed first. He pulled a heavy iron bar from his belt and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. Thomas Crow and 2 others joined him, and together they pried the lock free. The wood splintered, and the door swung open. Inside, 10 girls stared at them, their eyes wide with fear and hope. "Mary," Gideon whispered. His daughter ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. The other girls followed, rushing out of the shed and into the arms of their parents. But there was no time for relief. Footsteps pounded across the dirt yard. Samuel Granger appeared, his gray beard wild, his eyes filled with fury. He held a Colt Navy revolver in his hand. "You goddamn," he started to say. Gideon moved faster. He'd carried a short hunting spear, the kind used to finish wounded deer. He stepped forward and drove the blade into Granger's chest, just below the ribs. The old man's eyes went wide. He dropped the revolver and staggered backward, clutching at the spear shaft. He fell to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt. Gideon pulled the spear free and stepped back. Granger collapsed face first into the dirt and didn't move again. One of the overseers, a man named Cobb, came running from the barn. He saw Granger's body and raised his rifle. Elias stepped out of the shadows behind him. He swung a wood-splitting axe in a wide arc. The blade caught Cobb in the side of the neck. The man dropped without a sound. Chaos erupted across the plantation. The fire in the barn spread to a second building. Flames lit the night sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The remaining overseers ran in different directions, shouting, trying to organize a defense. But they were too late. The enslaved workers poured out of their cabins, carrying tools, axes, and stolen weapons. They had been waiting for this moment. Some for years, others for their entire lives. They moved with purpose, surrounding the overseers, cutting off escape routes. One overseer tried to reach the main house. Jonah intercepted him at the porch steps and drove a pitchfork through his stomach. The man screamed and fell. Another overseer fired his rifle wildly into the darkness. The shot missed. A group of enslaved men tackled him to the ground and beat him with shovels and hoes until he stopped moving. Edward Granger, Samuel's brother, tried to flee through the back door of the main house. He ran toward the stables, hoping to reach a horse. But a woman named Ruth, who had worked in the kitchen for 15 years, stepped into his path. She held a butcher knife. "Please," Edward began. Ruth didn't let him finish. She stabbed him twice, once in the chest and once in the throat. He collapsed against the stable door and slid to the ground, his blood pooling in the dirt. By the time the sun began to rise, every white man on the plantation was dead. The enslaved workers and the hunters gathered in the yard as dawn broke. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving the barns as smoking ruins. The main house still stood, but no one cared about it anymore. Gideon stood with the 10 girls, making sure each one was reunited with her parents. They were crying, clinging to their families, but they were alive. Elias approached Gideon. "We can't stay here," he said. "When people find out what happened, they'll come with dogs and guns. They'll hunt all of us." Gideon nodded. "Then we burn the rest of it. We destroy everything so they can't use it again." The group moved quickly. They set fire to the main house, watching as the flames consumed the porch, the parlor, the bedrooms where Samuel Granger had slept. They burned the records, the bills of sale, the ledgers, the documents that proved ownership of human beings. They opened the gates and released the horses. They smashed the tools used for punishment, the whips, the chains, the iron collars. By mid-morning, Black River Plantation was nothing but ash and memory. The group, now more than 50 people, moved north and west, following the Big Black River toward Vicksburg. There were freed black communities there, places where fugitives could find shelter and disappear. As they walked, the children began to sing, old songs, songs their grandmothers had taught them, songs about freedom and home. 3 days later, a neighbor rode past Black River Plantation and saw the ruins. He reported it to the sheriff in Holmes County. A group of white men rode out to investigate. They found bodies. They found burned buildings. They found wagon tracks leading north. The sheriff wrote a report. He called it a slave uprising. He said that a group of runaways had killed Samuel Granger and destroyed his property. But he didn't organize a manhunt. He didn't send men after the fugitives. Because he was afraid. The other plantation owners in Holmes County read the report and felt the same fear. If enslaved people could organize, could fight back, could kill white men and destroy property, what would stop them from doing it again? The local newspapers printed brief stories about the incident, but they avoided details. They didn't want to give other slaves ideas. They didn't want to inspire more rebellions. Within a week, the story disappeared from the papers. But it didn't disappear from memory. In the slave quarters across Mississippi, people whispered about what had happened at Black River. They told the story of the 10 girls who were taken and the parents who came to get them back. They told the story of Gideon Redpath and the hunters who killed the masters and freed the plantation. And in those whispers, the story became something more than history. It became hope. The journey north lasted 6 days. The group of 53 people moved through forests and swamps, avoiding main roads and towns where white men might see them. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping during the day in hidden camps deep in the woods. The children were exhausted, their feet blistered and bleeding, but no one complained. They understood that stopping meant death. Gideon led the way, using skills his Choctaw grandfather had taught him as a boy. He read the land like other men read books, finding water sources, identifying edible plants, choosing paths that left few tracks. Behind him walked the 10 girls who had been taken from the settlement, staying close to their parents, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Mary, Gideon's daughter, walked beside him most of the time, her hand gripping the back of his shirt as if she feared he might disappear. Elias and Jonah organized the larger group, making sure the elderly and the children kept pace, distributing food when they had it, rationing water when streams were scarce. The 2 men had become leaders not by choice, but by necessity. They had helped plan the revolt at Black River Plantation, and now they carried the responsibility of keeping everyone alive long enough to reach safety. On the second night, they crossed into Madison County. The land here was rolling hills covered in pine and oak, with small farms scattered between stretches of wilderness. They saw lights from distant houses but stayed far from them, moving through the darkest parts of the forest where moonlight barely penetrated the canopy. A woman named Sarah carried her youngest child, a boy of 3, on her back. She had worked in the fields at Black River for 8 years, brought there from a plantation in Alabama after her first owner died. Her husband had been sold away before she was taken to Mississippi, and she had not seen him since. Now she walked in silence, her face set with determination. When someone asked if she needed help carrying the boy, she shook her head. "I carried him into slavery," she said quietly. "I'll carry him out." They reached the Big Black River on the 3rd day. The river was wide and slow, its dark water reflecting the gray October sky. Thomas Crow found a shallow crossing where the current was weak and the bottom was gravel instead of mud. They crossed in small groups, holding hands to keep from being swept away. The children went first, carried on the backs of the strongest men. The water came up to their waists, cold and thick with silt. On the far bank they rested for an hour. Some of the women built a small fire, shielded by rocks so the smoke wouldn't be visible from a distance. They cooked cornmeal mush and divided it among the children. There wasn't much food left. They had brought what they could from the plantation, but feeding 53 people required more than they had. Gideon and Thomas scouted ahead while the others rested. They climbed a low ridge and looked south, checking for signs of pursuit. They saw nothing. No riders, no dogs, no dust from horses on distant roads. Gideon knew that didn't mean they were safe. It only meant the hunters hadn't caught up yet. "How far to Vicksburg?" Thomas asked. "Another 3 days if we keep this pace," Gideon said. "Maybe 4. Will they take us in?" "They have to," Gideon said. "There's nowhere else to go." Vicksburg was a river town on the Mississippi, a place where steamboats stopped to load cotton and passengers. It was also home to a small community of freed blacks who had bought their own freedom or escaped from plantations years earlier. Some of them worked as laborers on the docks, others ran small businesses, barbershops, laundries, restaurants. They lived in a section of town white people called the Bottoms, a collection of wooden shacks built on low ground near the river that flooded every spring. Gideon had been to Vicksburg twice before, trading furs and venison for salt, sugar and gunpowder. He knew a man there named Solomon Blake, a blacksmith who had bought his freedom in 1840 and now owned a small forge near the waterfront. Solomon was known for helping runaways, hiding them in his workshop until they could board a boat heading north or west. If they could reach Solomon, they had a chance. But 3 days was a long time when people were hunting you. On the fourth night, they crossed through Warren County, staying close to Bogue Chitto Creek. The water was shallow and clear, and they followed it west, using the creek bed to hide their tracks. The children were struggling now, too tired to walk without stumbling. One of the older men, a field worker named Isaac who was nearly 60, collapsed near the bank of the creek. Jonah and another man carried him for the next 2 miles until they found a place to rest. Elias sat beside Isaac and gave him water from a wooden canteen. The old man drank slowly, his hands shaking. "I'm slowing you down," Isaac said. "You're coming with us," Elias said. "We didn't leave Black River just to leave people behind now." They rested for 2 hours, then continued moving. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Rain began to fall just after midnight, a cold drizzle that soaked through their clothes and made the ground slippery. The children cried softly, and the adults wrapped them in whatever cloth they had, torn blankets, pieces of burlap sacks, strips of cotton pulled from their own shirts. By dawn, they were within 10 miles of Vicksburg. Gideon sent Thomas ahead to find Solomon Blake and let him know they were coming. Thomas left at first light, moving fast through the trees, a knife tucked into his belt and a small pouch of dried venison in his pack. The rest of the group found shelter in a dense thicket of cane and briars, a place where they could hide during the day. They huddled together for warmth, the children pressed between the adults, everyone shivering in wet clothes. There was no fire. Smoke would give them away. Gideon sat with Mary, his arm around her shoulders. She had barely spoken since they left Black River. Sometimes at night he heard her crying quietly, but when he asked if she was all right, she only nodded. He didn't push her. There would be time for words later, when they were safe. If they ever were. Around midday, one of the younger men named Daniel climbed a tree to watch the road. He stayed up there for an hour, scanning the horizon. When he came down, his face was pale. "Riders," he said. "Maybe a mile south, moving slow, like they're looking for something." Gideon's jaw tightened. "How many?" "6, maybe 7. They have dogs." The group fell silent. Dogs meant they could be tracked even through water, even through thick brush. Dogs meant the hunters were serious. Elias stood and checked the rifle he had taken from one of the overseers at Black River. It was loaded, but he only had 4 shots left. Jonah had a pistol with 2 bullets. Gideon had his spear and a knife. The others had axes, hoes, and sharpened sticks. It wasn't enough to fight 7 armed white men. "We keep moving," Gideon said. "Staying here means dying here." They left the thicket and moved west, staying low, using every bit of cover the land offered. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft, and their footprints were easy to see. Gideon knew the dogs would find their trail eventually. They needed to reach Vicksburg before that happened. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the town. They could see the river in the distance, wide and brown, with steamboats moored at the docks. Smoke rose from chimneys in the white part of town, and they could hear the faint sounds of hammers and saws from workshops near the waterfront. Thomas was waiting for them at the edge of a cotton field, hidden behind a broken wagon. He waved them over, his face tense. "Solomon knows you're coming," Thomas said. "He's clearing space in his forge, but we have to move now. There are slave catchers in town asking questions. Someone saw a large group moving through the countryside, and they're offering money for information." "How much time do we have?" Gideon asked. "Maybe an hour, maybe less." They moved quickly through the back streets of Vicksburg, avoiding the main roads where white men gathered. The freed black community lived in a cluster of small homes and shacks near the river, built on stilts to keep them above the floodwaters. Solomon Blake's forge sat at the end of a narrow alley, a low building made of brick with a tin roof and a stone chimney. Solomon was waiting outside. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his arms scarred from years of working hot iron. When he saw the group approaching, 53 people exhausted and filthy, some limping, others carrying children, his eyes widened. "Jesus," he said quietly, "how many did you bring?" "Everyone," Gideon said. "We brought everyone." Solomon looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Get them inside, quick." The forge had a large workspace in the front and 2 storage rooms in the back. Solomon and several other freed blacks who lived nearby helped move the group into the building, packing them into every available space. The children sat on the floor, leaning against each other. The adults stood where they could find room. It was hot inside, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and sweat. Solomon closed the doors and barred them from the inside. "You can't stay long," he said. "If the catchers find you here, they'll burn this place down with all of us inside." "We need a boat," Gideon said. "Something heading north or west. Anything that gets us out of Mississippi." Solomon shook his head. "Every boat on that river is watched. The captains report to the harbor master, and the harbor master reports to the sheriff. If you try to board a steamboat, you'll be arrested before you get halfway up the gangplank. Then what do we do?" Solomon thought for a moment, then turned to one of the other men in the room, a thin man with gray hair named Eli. "You still have that flatboat?" Eli nodded slowly. "It's old, leaks a little, but it floats." "Where is it?" "Tied up south of the docks near the sandbar." Solomon looked at Gideon. "It's not much, but it's all we've got. You take that boat tonight, float downriver to the Louisiana side, then move inland. There are Choctaw communities in northern Louisiana that might take you in. It's not safe, but it's better than staying here." Gideon nodded. "We'll take it." They waited in the forge until nightfall. The air inside grew hotter as the hours passed, and some of the children fainted from exhaustion and heat. The women fanned them with pieces of cloth and gave them water from a barrel Solomon kept in the corner. Outside, they heard voices, men walking past the forge, talking and laughing. At one point, someone pounded on the door and shouted, asking if Solomon had seen any runaways. Solomon stepped outside and told the man he hadn't seen anyone. The man seemed satisfied and moved on. When full darkness came, Solomon led them out through a back door that opened onto the riverbank. They moved in a long line, staying low, following the edge of the water. The Mississippi was wide and black, its surface rippling in the moonlight. Ahead, they could see the lights of the steamboats at the main docks, and beyond that, the dark shapes of warehouses and cotton sheds. Eli's flatboat was tied to a willow tree a quarter-mile downstream. It was a crude vessel, maybe 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, built from rough-cut planks and sealed with tar. A single oar lay across the deck, used for steering. It wasn't designed to carry 53 people, but it would have to. They boarded carefully, trying not to make noise. The boat sagged under the weight, and water seeped through gaps in the planks. Some of the men used their shirts to plug the leaks, pressing the cloth into the cracks. When everyone was aboard, Eli and Jonah used long poles to push the boat away from the bank. The current caught it immediately, pulling it into the middle of the river. The flatboat turned slowly, drifting south with the flow of the water. Gideon stood at the front of the boat, watching the lights of Vicksburg fade behind them. Mary sat at his feet, her head resting against his leg. Around them the others sat in silence, too exhausted to speak. They floated through the night, the river carrying them south and west. No one knew exactly where they were going. Louisiana was dangerous. It was a slave state, just like Mississippi, with laws that made fugitives into property and property into money. But it was also vast, with swamps and forests where people could disappear if they knew how to survive. By dawn, they had traveled 15 miles. The river had widened and the land on both sides had changed from farmland to thick forest. Gideon steered the boat toward the western bank, looking for a place to land. They found a narrow inlet surrounded by cypress trees and dragged the boat onto a muddy shore. They were in Louisiana now, somewhere south of Lake Providence, in a stretch of wilderness that belonged to no one and everyone. Elias stood on the shore and looked at the others. "We need to decide where we go from here," he said. "We can't stay on the river. Too many boats, too many eyes. We need to move inland." "There are Choctaw settlements west of here," Thomas said. "My grandmother came from one of them near Black River Lake. If we can find them, they might help us." "And if they don't?" someone asked. Thomas didn't answer. Gideon looked at the group, the 53 people who had survived Black River Plantation, who had walked for 6 days and floated down the Mississippi on a leaking boat. They were exhausted, starving, and desperate, but they were alive, and they were free. "We keep going," Gideon said. "We find the settlements, and if they won't take us, we build our own." No one argued. They moved west, into the forests of northeastern Louisiana. The land here was different from Mississippi, wetter, thicker, with stands of oak and gum trees rising out of black water. They followed animal trails and dry ridges, avoiding open ground where they might be seen. On the second day in Louisiana, they found a creek with clear water and stopped to drink and wash. The children played in the shallow water, splashing and laughing for the first time since the raid on Black River. The adults sat on the banks, cleaning wounds, mending torn clothes, and trying to rest. Sarah, the woman who had carried her son on her back, sat beside Gideon and looked out at the forest. "Do you think we'll ever be safe?" she asked. Gideon didn't answer right away. He watched Mary crouching at the edge of the creek, her fingers tracing patterns in the mud. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I know we're safer than we were." Sarah nodded. "That's enough for now." They traveled for 2 more days, moving deeper into the wilderness. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they saw smoke rising from a clearing ahead. Gideon and Thomas moved forward carefully, weapons ready, expecting to find a white settlement or a logging camp. Instead, they found a Choctaw village. It was small, maybe 15 families, living in traditional homes made of woven cane and thatched roofs. Gardens surrounded the homes, filled with corn, beans, and squash. Children played near a central fire pit, and women worked at looms, weaving cloth from plant fibers. An old man stepped forward when he saw Gideon and Thomas. He wore a long shirt decorated with shell beads and carried a walking stick carved with symbols. He studied them for a long moment, then spoke in Choctaw. Thomas answered in the same language. They talked for several minutes, and then the old man nodded and gestured for them to bring the others forward. The group emerged from the trees, 53 people, dirty, exhausted, carrying children and wounded elders. The Choctaw villagers stared at them, silent. The old man spoke again, his voice calm but firm. Thomas translated for the others. "He says this land is for people who have nowhere else to go. He says we can stay." Relief swept through the group like a wave. Some of the women began to cry. Men who had not smiled in weeks smiled now, cautiously, as if afraid the moment might break. Solomon's words had been right. It wasn't safe, but it was better than what they had left behind. Over the next weeks, the group began to rebuild their lives. The Choctaw villagers shared food and helped them build shelters. They taught them which plants were safe to eat, which roots could be used for medicine, and how to move through the swamp without leaving tracks. In return, the formerly enslaved people shared skills they had learned on plantations: blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, and farming techniques. Gideon and Mary built a small home at the edge of the village, near the creek where the water ran clear. Every morning, Gideon woke before dawn and walked through the trees, checking for signs of danger. Every evening he returned to find Mary sitting by the fire, weaving baskets from dried reeds the way the Choctaw women had taught her. One night, as they sat together, Mary spoke for the first time about what had happened in the shed at Black River. "I thought we were going to die," she said quietly. "I thought we would never see you again." Gideon pulled her close. "I would have walked through hell to find you," he said, "and I would do it again." She nodded, her face pressed against his shoulder. "I know." Elias and Jonah became leaders in the growing community. They organized work crews to clear land for gardens, built a communal smokehouse for preserving meat, and trained young men in how to defend the settlement if danger came. They knew that safety was temporary, that slave catchers might come eventually, that Mississippi was only a day's walk away. But for now, they had shelter, food, and something they had not had before. They had hope. Months passed, winter came, and the swamps froze at night. The community survived on stored corn, dried fish, and venison from hunting. When spring arrived, they planted gardens and expanded the village. New families arrived, runaways from Arkansas, freed blacks from Louisiana, a few Choctaw families who had been living alone in the wilderness. The settlement grew, and back in Mississippi, in the burned ruins of Black River Plantation, the story grew too. White plantation owners told the story in whispers, their voices tight with fear. They talked about the night the slaves rose up, the night Samuel Granger was killed, the night everything burned. They hired more overseers, bought more guns, built higher fences around their slave quarters. They didn't talk about it publicly, afraid that speaking the story out loud would make it spread. But in the slave quarters across Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, the story spread anyway. People told it to each other in the fields, in the kitchens, in the darkness before sleep. They told the story of the 10 girls who were taken and the parents who came to get them back. They told the story of Gideon Redpath and the hunters who killed the masters. They told the story of the 53 people who walked away from slavery and lived. And in those stories, something changed. Fear turned to anger, anger turned to courage, and courage turned to action. By the time the Civil War began 7 years later, the story of Black River Plantation had become legend. It was told in different ways, with different details, but the core remained the same. A story of parents who refused to accept the loss of their children, of people who fought back, of a community that chose freedom over fear. Historians would argue about whether the story was true. Some would say it was exaggerated, that the numbers were inflated, that no such event could have happened without more documentation. Others would point to the burned plantation, the missing people, the silence of the local newspapers. But for the people who lived through it, and for the generations who heard the story from their grandparents, the truth was simple. 10 girls were taken, their parents came for them, and when it was over, 53 people were free. That was enough.